73rd anniversary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying this.
In the future days, which we seek to make secure,
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Today is the 73rd anniversary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying this.
in the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armament to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
There you go. It's called the Four Freedoms Speech. Professor Harvey Kaye has a new book out, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. Actually, the book is not quite out yet, but I believe you can order it online and certainly from your favorite bookstore. It's called The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. You can use Twitter as Harvey J. Kaye, K-A-Y-E. He's the professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Professor Harvey Kaye, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
It's great to have you. So, first of all, hell of a speech. What happened to the Four Freedoms?
What happened to the Four Freedoms? Well, first thing to understand, of course, is that Roosevelt knew something about Americans that too many other presidents don't seem to realize, and that is that in the face of crisis, what it means to be an American is you raise the stakes in a progressive way. You don't retreat. And before, through the New Deal years, confronting the Great Depression, through World War II, Roosevelt had confidence in his fellow citizens, and with good reason. He knew what Americans were capable of doing, and he knew what Americans wanted at war's end. And when war's end came, Americans set out to realize those four freedoms, if not always for the world, at least to set up America along those lines. And what happened to it? Rightist reaction. Almost immediately at the end of the war, the right and the corporate rich mobilized to suppress those aspirations. They contested labor organizing, and we end up with the right-wing legislation in Congress known as the Taft-Hartley Act, a whole series of initiatives on the part of big business to not simply, as once upon a time they had, try to suppress the four freedoms, but actually to try to co-opt them and to manipulate them. During the war, there were those who said, well, the four freedoms are good, but we need a fifth freedom, freedom of enterprise, private enterprise, free enterprise. After the war, they accepted that they accepted the fact there was probably no going back. At least many of them accepted there was no going back to the days before the New Deal. But the idea of extending freedom, equality, and democracy and pushing the four freedoms even further in America was not on business's agenda and decidedly not on the conservative agenda.
So, I'd say in a small way, Lyndon Johnson brought that back with the Great Society, although it was so badly tainted and contaminated by the Vietnam War.
Oh, absolutely, Tom. the same generation that came of age in the Great Depression and advanced the New Deal by their own labors in the CCC and the WPA, and then went on to fight in World War II. You know, these 16 million young Americans, they enter middle age in the 1960s, and I actually would argue that it's that same generation that issues the call for the Great Society, issues the call for civil rights, issues the call for many of the progressive initiatives of the 60s, and ends up enacting them, basically, you know, pushed and encouraged by, well, your and my generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, by the boomers, the
those
generation that followed.
Into our teen and early adulthood in the 60s.
Yeah. And where are we now? I mean, now it seems like we have...
Well, I think for 40 years now, ever since Ronald Reagan, and maybe even to some extent, I think under Jimmy Carter in the 70s, we've seen a war against the four freedoms. And we've even seen a retreat on the part of Democrats in their, after 4 decades, in their commitment to advancing those four freedoms. In fact, I have an idea. It seems to me that we progressives ought to sort of set up a scorecard. There are those who like to set up a scorecard on how much the national debt grows, or William Bennett's scorecard on what happened to American values. Well, we need to set up a scorecard in which we keep a record of just how much our liberal and progressive politicians actually pursue the four freedoms, right? Mm. We ought to be asking ourselves regularly, are they actually trying to live up to the democratic aspirations of the greatest generation, which we ourselves carry forth, but we don't necessarily advance effectively?
Hey, you see, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedom from fear is basically let's not have war around the world. The UN was, the great hope for that. Freedom from want, though, I think is the most interesting. FDR made government the employer of last resort. When capitalism fails, government would step in with the CCC, the WPA, and all those other agencies. Why aren't we turning to that? What has happened to that idea that, where FDR said the best welfare program is a job? When did we lose that, Harvey? Professor K.
We lost that somewhere in the course of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. I mean, one of the things is that right after the war, there were those labor leaders who recognized that they had to work with liberals to advance the agenda. But they were concerned that even liberals seemed to see the agenda as something that was pursued in Congress, that there was a series of legislative initiatives. And by the 1950s and 60s, labor lost, except for public employees perhaps, but labor lost that drive to advance the four freedoms from the bottom up. They
lost a lot of their power because of Taft-Hartley in 47.
Well, they did, except they lost their power basicly to advance in the South.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's where.
Right. The old South. Yeah. The old Confederate states.
California, things advanced.
Right.
But it's in the South where they lost that effort, and unfortunately, the alliance between labor and civil rights was a very, very uneven one. Labor did underwrite many civil rights struggles and initiatives. The UAW and others, and some of the predominantly black unions. But the Civil Rights Labor Alliance just wasn't strong enough and probably should have been more effective in advancing not just civil rights, but civil rights and workers' rights in the South during the 1960s. I mean, considering the majority of African Americans in the South were themselves working people. So I don't know I don't think it was lost at that time. But I think,
Has the South won? We have just a few seconds left. Has the South won? Are we in since the Bush presidency?
Well, the South has won if you consider that for 40 years we've been living under a kind of a Reagan New Right agenda. The trick is, do we turn the tide in 2014, 2016, and start advancing the four freedoms in a new way? That's the question.
That is absolutely the question. Professor Harvey K., his new book is The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. Harvey J.K. at Twitter.